My name is Kasper Thybier. I wish to bid you welcome to Haxan, the Witch, a film like no other, an exploration of the demon-haunted mindset of the distant past. We begin with the powerful gaze of Benjamin Christensen, one of the most original and daring of silent filmmakers. He speaks of himself as I in the intertitles, leaving us in no doubt that this film is his work, even as he thanks his cinematographer and his set designer. For this film, he spent at least 2 years on extensive research into the history of witchcraft. He even provided a bibliography for the film, which can be found elsewhere on the DVD. I shall begin by giving an overview of the background of this extraordinary filmmaker. But first, let me provide you with an outline of Haxan. It is in many ways an unusual film. One aspect of this is its structure, its deliberate avoidance of standard narrative form. It is divided into 7 sections, each of which corresponds to a reel of film. The first section resembles an illustrated lecture more than anything else, with a series of old pictures of witches, demons, and other supernatural phenomena. Since many of them appear too briefly to say much about their origin, the available background information about these images has been placed in a separate section of the DVD. Instead, I will concentrate on Christensen's background during this part of the film. From section 2 onwards, the film turns to vivid reenactments of the world of witchcraft beliefs. Here, I shall speak in more detail about what sort of film Haxan really is. Can it be called a documentary? I will go on to compare Christensen's treatment of witchcraft with the descriptions offered by modern historians. Then, I will discuss Christensen's technical innovations and also say something about how the film was greeted by audiences and reviewers at the time. I will talk about Christensen's career after the completion of Haxan and his highly advanced ideas about what film art should be. Finally, at the end, the film moves into the modern period and attempts to draw a parallel between witchcraft and hysteria. And I will say something about how this reflects the opinion of many leading experts at the time, particularly psychiatrists and other medical men, and I will discuss these experts and their theories in some detail. I believe that will give the best understanding of what Christensen was really trying to do. Benjamin Christensen himself originally trained to be a doctor. He was born in 1879, the youngest of 12 children, in a medium-sized Danish provincial town. At the age of 18, he went up to the University of Copenhagen, but he was not a terribly diligent student. After a couple of years, a new career suddenly beckoned. Christensen was living in a ground-floor apartment, and one morning he was singing loudly while shaving. A man popped his head in the open window and insisted that he audition for a place at the Opera Academy of the Danish Royal Theatre. The man turned out to be a well-known opera singer, and Christensen decided to make the attempt. He was accepted as the only one of 40 applicants and was furthermore accepted as an acting student as well. He made his operatic debut in 1902. The reviewers admired his powerful bass baritone, but a nervous illness soon deprived him of his singing voice. He turned to acting and became very popular at one of the leading provincial theatres. His nervousness continued to plague him, however, and he eventually had to give up the stage altogether. In later years, he told a story about his voice. He went to the United States in 1916 to market his film Blind Justice. He was staying at the old Knickerbocker Hotel on the corner of Broadway and 42nd Street in New York. When he was by himself, the voice sometimes came back and he began singing in the bathtub. Suddenly, the phone rang. A gentleman was waiting in the hall of the hotel who wanted to speak with him at once. A short, heavy-set Italian introduced himself, Enrico Caruso, the world-famous tenor. He was staying in the room next to Christensen's and had heard him sing. "A fantastic voice! You must perform with me!" Christensen had to refuse. He could only sing when there was no audience, or when at least he thought that there was no audience. You may notice that when the pointer here is moved rapidly, there is a bit of afterimage. It is present in the original film image, caused by the relatively slow speed the film was shot at, around 20 frames per second, and the rapidity of the movement. Now, after having left the theatre, Christensen went into business. He became the Danish representative of a French champagne company, apparently a lucrative affair. Christensen had briefly considered working in films when he lost his voice, but he saw little opportunity for artistry in this new medium. It was only when he saw the breakthrough performance of Asta Nielsen, the greatest Danish star of the silent screen, in the film Afgrunden, The Abyss from 1910, that he realized the tremendous potential of this new art form. In early 1912, he became a film actor. He appeared in several films, but they have all been lost. It seems certain, however, that Christensen was dissatisfied with the technical quality of these productions and decided that he could do better. He convinced the managers of the company that he should be given a chance to direct. The resulting film was called Det hemmelighedsfulde X, which means The Mysterious X, but at the time it was distributed in the English-speaking world as Sealed Orders. Shooting commenced in August 1913, and the film was 3 months in production. This was quite exceptional. The norm in Denmark seems to have been a couple of weeks. Budget figures are difficult to establish reliably, but seem to have been comparably ambitious, so that The Mysterious X cost 3 to 4 times as much as a typical production from a minor Danish film company. The film opened in March 1914 and was a huge success, earning rave reviews. Christensen went on a sales trip across Europe and the film was sold everywhere. He did, however, have to overcome some difficulties. The film is a spy story, and this was the summer of 1914. War was on the horizon, and spy films had been outlawed in both Germany and Austria-Hungary. After negotiations with the Prussian War Ministry and a few judicious cuts and title changes, turning spies into smugglers, the film was allowed to pass. What was really remarkable about The Mysterious X, however, was not its somewhat preposterous story, but its extraordinary command of cinematic language. The quality and assurance of both editing and camera work can measure up to the very best films of the period. Particularly noteworthy is the use of single-source lighting to create dramatic shadow effects. Some setups are shot directly against the light, giving sharply edged silhouettes. Others have strong lights falling from the side into dark rooms, creating an intricate interplay of light and shadow. Some scenes have characters turning lights on or off, necessitating complex lighting changes. The acting is generally excellent. Christensen himself plays the lead with authority, although in emotional scenes he uses the histrionic style derived from the conventions of the 19th century stage, which today look somewhat excessive. His next film was Blind Justice. The original Danish title is Hævnens Nat, literally Night of Vengeance. Christensen again plays the lead, and this time he's much better. The reviewers praised his performance as Strong John, a man wrongfully jailed for many years who, though fearsome-looking, nevertheless remains a decent man. Not just the acting, but the film as a whole shows that Christensen was not content to rest on his laurels. It is as technically dazzling as The Mysterious X, and even more assured in its direction. Christensen took the film to the United States, and the leading trade paper, Moving Picture World, gave it a rave review, praising the work of Benjamin Christie, as he was called. An absolutely unique feature of this production is that it presents a unity and homogeneity not possessed by any other, for it is the work of Mr. Christie alone. He wrote the story, he directed the picture, enacted the leading role, edited, and did all else in connection with the finishing touches, thus making a perfect whole which proclaims it to be the creation of one sole mastermind. Vitagraph, one of the leading American production companies, offered Christensen the job of supervising director, which would have meant that all the other directors at Vitagraph would refer to him. But he turned it down, having already begun planning Haxan. He had become interested in the subject of witchcraft earlier on, and some of his experiences in the United States provided a further impulse. At one point, he went to Sing Sing prison, where he held a special screening of Blind Justice. One convict was knifed during the show. There, he had been tremendously impressed by the warden Thomas Mott Osborne, celebrated for his enlightened and reformist ideas. In the 1940s, many years later, Christensen wrote about Osborne. "Today, we are all aware that the great American was right in his unshakable faith that even in the most hardened criminal, there is something human to which one may profitably appeal. His ideas, which were novel at the beginning of the century, have gradually borne fruit across most of the civilized world." The visit to Sing Sing, according to a journalist who interviewed him, stimulated his concern with injustice, with the ways beliefs in absolute evil have led to the persecution of people who suffered from illnesses or simply were ahead of their time. Christensen was also fascinated by the supernatural, and Haxan grew out of these preoccupations. It was not until the beginning of 1919, however, that he found a production company that was willing to take him on. He had sold his own studio because the World War made it very difficult to market films internationally, but now he was hired by Svenska Biografteatern, the leading Swedish production company. Its head was Charles Magnusson, a pioneer producer who made possible the brief golden age of the Swedish cinema in the years just before and after 1920. He gave his top directors, Victor Sjöström and Mauritz Stiller, the resources they needed to make first-class films, and, as importantly, complete artistic freedom. The result was a string of classic films. Sjöström made The Outlaw and His Wife and The Phantom Carriage, Stiller The Song of the Scarlet Flower, Sir Arne's Treasure, and The Story of Gösta Berling. Magnusson respected talent, and it did not matter that Christensen was not Swedish. Christensen told an interviewer that this prospect of artistic freedom was tremendously important to him, and that he found Magnusson's attitude very agreeable. Up to this point, the film has followed a format which remains popular in educational films and television documentaries, although the pointer has been replaced by the zoom lens. But now the film changes tack in striking fashion. We leave the still images behind, and the past is brought to life. With staged scenes like this, using actors, sets, costumes, careful lighting, and, as we shall see, special effects, we certainly seem to have stepped outside the bounds of the documentary genre as we know it today. Instead, we find ourselves in a witch's kitchen with an animal skeleton above the fireplace and a pot of witch's brew being cooked. Magic potions are made here with all sorts of vile ingredients. In the 16th century, the corpses of hanged thieves were usually left to rot on the gallows, and so it was not impossible to steal a finger. Such fingers had magical powers. They would contain some of the good fortune of the thief who had died early and not used it all up. The Danish historian Troels Lund recounts the story of two women from Elsinore who were convicted of having tried to improve their sales of liquor by placing a thief's finger in the liquor jar. They had obtained the finger by sneaking up to the gallows while people were sleeping, and they found a dead old thief's corpse which had dropped down from the gallows. They twisted off one hand and hid it in a sack of firewood. When they came home, they each took a finger, but discovered that they were not the first. 2 fingers were already missing from the hand. So, with this grotesque sequence, Christensen would argue, we are still within the realm of historical fact. It is important to remember that at the time Christensen made Haxan, the documentary film did not yet exist as a real genre. Of course, from the very beginning of cinema, there had been many films showing the real world, street scenes, scenic views, and what were called actualities, or films of current events. There had also been a number of rather successful nature films showing animals in the wild. Nevertheless, Robert Flaherty's Nanook of the North from 1922 is usually held to be the first documentary, in the sense of a film making creative use of actuality, in the famous phrase of the preeminent documentarist John Grierson. Various writers had already seen the potential for a film of this sort. One of them was the Danish film publicist Jens Locker, who wrote in January 1922. The film dramas, with their heroes and heroines, will surely maintain their hold on the audience and continue to prosper. There is, however, another side of life which would seem to be a matter for the moving picture, and which many who believe in the future of the film are eager to see brought within its domain, and that is the half-journalistic, half-artistic description of life's events. When weekly newsreels first appeared, Locker continues, and the foundation was thus laid for the living newspaper, it was hoped that this would develop in the direction of a real description of life. But these newsreels stuck to certain official occurrences and events and did not seek to submit to the demands of art, but only to be matter-of-factly descriptive. Locker suggested that filmmakers should take their cameras out into the streets or the countryside and seek to capture real life on the fly, to show the intimate details of human life in a way similar to the way nature films showed the life of animals. While this analogy implies a somewhat condescending attitude, the description still fits many early documentaries very well. On the other hand, it does not really fit Haxan well at all. When Locker wrote his article, Haxan was still in preparation and shrouded in secrecy. Still, Locker suggests that the film might well prove to advance the art of cinema several steps in a new direction, a promise he declared in ringing tones was fulfilled when the film opened some months later. To present factual matters in an artistically fulfilling fashion was very evidently Christensen's goal. Apart from Haxan, he had also considered the possibility of making a film about the work of the Austrian physiologist Eugen Steinach, famous for his research into hermaphroditism and the action of sex hormones. Christensen was very concerned to ensure that his film was as authoritative and as true to the facts as possible. He wrote, "When I began the preparations for my film Haxan, I had envisaged that professional historians would develop the screenplay for me, or at least supply me with significant help in that direction. But in the course of a couple of conversations, during which, by the way, I was shown the greatest interest and courtesy, it emerged firstly that Danish scholars felt very fearful about having to do with film, and secondly, that the cinematographic manuscript treatment of the material was so foreign to them that they rather quickly declined this work. There was nothing left for me to do but to master the vast amount of source material that touches on the problem of witchcraft on my own." Christensen went on to express the hope that Haxan might open the eyes of men of science to the potential of the motion picture as a medium of popularization, a way of bringing new knowledge to a vast popular audience. This mission certainly aligns Haxan with the documentary film. Yet documentaries are supposed to show the real world, and certainly not employ actors, like the famous comedian Oscar Stribold, whom we see here as the monk, to cavort about in farcical scenes. Indeed, documentaries that manipulate what they show, for instance for propaganda purposes, are sometimes said to be fictional. But fictional and fraudulent are not the same. Fictional films do not claim to be real. Documentaries, on the other hand, claim that what they show is true, and we, as spectators, understand that the filmmaker intends for us to accept what we see as fact. The truth claim is clearly there. This assertion of factuality, whether deceptive or not, is taken to be the essential defining feature of the documentary film by present-day theorists like Karl Plantinga and Noel Carroll. Under that definition, Haxan is a documentary of sorts, even if it is in some ways clearly a borderline case. Just as important for Christensen as the factual content was making a film that was a work of art. In a 1921 article, Christensen explained what he wanted to accomplish with his film, and, as we shall see, the true identity of these two furtive figures have a lot to do with it. I want to seek a way forward to original films. And my Swedish financiers, in their unparalleled understanding, have given me free rein under my own moral responsibility. The task I have taken on is by no means easy. For I do not only seek to create original films, but also through my current work, I want to become clear to reach conclusions about whether film as an art form doesn't demand from us a much larger field of activity than we have thus far used. Does a film need to be entertaining exclusively? Isn't film the best way for mankind to broaden knowledge among the masses? Shouldn't it be possible for us to find for film's characteristically popular, clear, and reliable form other subjects than purely entertaining ones? Shouldn't it be possible for film to approach a problem in another way than through the social drama? I would like to know at this time whether a film is able to hold the public's interest without mass effects, without sentimentality, without unified narration, without suspense, without heroes and heroines, in short, without all those things on which a good film is otherwise constructed. My film consists of a series of small episodes that, as part of a mosaic, give expression to an idea. Giving expression to an idea, or as one might alternatively say, advancing an argument, has also been suggested as a defining feature of the documentary. It does not fit all documentaries equally well, but Haxan is certainly a film that advances an argument. One of its key features is the contrast between past ignorance and present-day knowledge. The two nocturnal body snatchers are a good example. They are not malefactors, but students of medicine, determined to learn the secrets of the human body despite the obscurantist prohibitions of the Church, which did not allow the anatomical dissection of human corpses. The contrast between past and present is already visible in the way the first section presents the historical background for the great witch craze. Christensen gives considerable attention to how various ancient civilizations pictured the universe. His wonderful models, with stars suspended from above and rotating celestial spheres, are very charming, but we know that they have little resemblance to the way the world actually is. In that way, they make the people of the past seem almost childishly ignorant. The contrast with the scientific knowledge of the universe possessed not only by modern astronomers, but even by the average filmgoer, is striking. Yet, Christensen is not an all-out rationalist. He does not see the witchcraft beliefs as completely delusional. He shows that they are real, at least to the extent that they have real effects. And he shows us some rather striking examples of this. A crucial point is made here about how seemingly delusional beliefs can take on a vivid reality. This fearsome devil is played by Christensen himself, underlining the power of darkness. We will meet the monks again. They are the witch hunters conducting the trial that comprises the central section of the film. And Christensen thus lets us understand that they are not simply evil or madmen. They believe firmly in the devil that holds their world in its grip. Christensen's film, in this way, goes to the heart of what makes the witchcraft persecutions so fascinating for historians. Witchcraft beliefs appear to be radically incorrect about what could happen in the real world, in the words of the historian Stuart Clark. How did people come to believe in such things? What was it like to live in a demon-haunted world? How can we explain that people reacted so violently to something that simply wasn't there? In this regard, a very important source for Christensen was the path-breaking Danish cultural historian Troels Lund, who wrote a massive 14-volume work called Daily Life in the Nordic Countries in the 16th Century, which appeared from 1879 to 1901. From this, Christensen not only drew many picturesque details, but also an understanding of how people thought about the devil. According to Troels Lund, belief in the devil emerged from the dualistic religion of ancient Persia, which is probably why Christensen begins his historical outline in the first section with demons from ancient Persia. From there, belief in the devil entered early Christianity. But during the Middle Ages, the power of the Church and the Pope made the devil seem less of a threat and more an object of ridicule, easily duped in folk tales by cunning blacksmiths or crofters. But as the Middle Ages waned, more people began to read the Bible and were impressed by the power Satan wields there. The world, life, nature was created by God and believed to be good, but how could one then account for evil? The answer was malicious devils, numberless hordes of devils. The theologians were much concerned with such demons, and pictures of them doing their evil deeds covered the walls of churches, filling people's imaginations and their dreams. The old woman, senseless with drink, will have such a dream, suggested by a wall painting reproduced in Troels Lund's book. Troels Lund writes that an expression commonly used about a witch woman was to call her the devil's dairymaid. At the time, Troels Lund writes, this easily suggested itself. The paramours of Catholic clergymen had been called their dairymaids, and that era seemed to find something ambiguous about the mere image of a butter churn. It was therefore a common subject in the wall paintings of both Danish and Swedish churches. A devil getting off with a woman churning butter. There is perhaps nothing that shows that epoch's curious mixture of unbridled wantonness and terror of hellfire more clearly than these odd church pictures. In this long sequence, Christensen, in elaborate detail and with the deployment of an impressive array of special effects, depicts a dream clearly fueled by raw and unsophisticated desires for money, food, and sex. There is something rather striking about the open acknowledgement here that old crones may still have nakedly erotic fantasies. But just as significant is the more subtle point that in including such a sequence in a movie, which clearly presents itself as a film of fact, Christensen shows that dreams too are a part of history. Now Christensen, by beginning with the witch's kitchen and showing people trying to work magic through potions, dead fingers and other means, allows for an element of fact behind some witchcraft accusations. He shows that there were cunning women and other workers of folk magic who believed themselves in the power of sorcery and who were thus easily suspected of being witches. There are some writers who have felt unsatisfied with the stark irrationality of witchcraft beliefs. Instead, they think that there was a hidden reality behind them, that the witch cult was something that actually existed, a survival into early modern times of ancient pagan religious practices, an organized counter-religion which was ferociously suppressed by the church. The 19th century French historian Jules Michelet was an early proponent of this idea, but it received its most influential expression in the book The Witch Cult in Western Europe, written by the English folklorist Margaret Murray and published in 1921. However, Murray distorted the sources that she quoted, leaving out all sorts of improbable supernatural events in order to make the confessions of witches seem more credible. And subsequent historical research has shown that there is really no evidence at all for the existence of such an organized counter-religion. The idea of the witches' Sabbath, rather than reflecting organized cult activity, is much more likely to have developed from the lurid horror stories that were told about the religious practices of the Jews and of heretics. Christensen certainly does not believe in any cult, just that people saw evil everywhere. Troels Lund writes, "The devil was no longer, as he had been a short time before, something distant and strange, who had been dimly heard, far away up in Sweden, hammering in the depths of the earth. No, in dreams or when awake, in each budding desire or resolved decision, the devil was close by. He stood behind the door, lay hidden in the canopy of the bed, scuttled about in the front room, stood right behind your back, flew at you like a fly. It was him who made that ball of yarn roll onto just your foot. It was him who prevented the black cow with the blaze from giving milk. Him who made the thieves' corpses on the gallows sway in time, and him who meowed like a cat in the yard at night." After having given us a sense of late medieval witchcraft beliefs, Christensen now turns his attention to witch hunting. He begins by giving us a thorough description of one of the most notorious witch-finding practices, the swimming test or ordeal by water, which usually strikes modern observers as almost absurd in its damned if you do, damned if you don't cruelty. It should be said that those shown to be innocent by sinking were not invariably drowned, even if their accusers did not always fish them out in time. The age of the great witch hunts does indeed seem like an almost inexplicable outbreak of horrifying barbarism. It lasted from the middle of the 15th century to the beginning of the 18th, with the most violent outbreaks concentrated in the years from 1580 to 1630. It affected all European countries as well as the American colonies, but the area along the River Rhine in Germany was by far the hardest hit. Christensen now proceeds to examine in detail the progress of a typical witchcraft trial, which will fill the next 3 sections. We begin with a sickbed scene, which underscores the impression of a world in the grip of superstition, where bizarre fortune-telling practices substitute for enlightened medicine. During the 3 centuries or so the persecutions lasted, it is estimated that 40,000 to 50,000 people were burned at the stake or otherwise executed for the crime of witchcraft. Sometimes much higher figures are given. Later in the film, we will see an intertitle that claims that more than 8 million people were killed, and 9 million is a figure one may easily come across in popular writings today. It is, however, completely false. It was generated by an 18th century anti-clerical propagandist. He came up with it by taking the execution figures for a single town from a small span of years when it suffered a particularly virulent outbreak, and assuming that these figures held good for the whole of Europe for a time span of no less than 11 centuries. Now, the 40,000 to 50,000 victims is still a very large number, even if it does not compare to those killed by war, for instance. In the great battles of the 30 Years' War, like Breitenfeld or Rocroi, 10,000 soldiers may have lost their lives in a single day. Nonetheless, in some places the impact of witchcraft persecutions was devastating. During the 1630s, the Archbishop Ferdinand of Cologne oversaw a ferocious witch hunt which resulted in some 2,000 executions from a population of perhaps 220,000. This means that close to 1 person in 100 was burnt at the stake. The worst years of the witch craze coincided with what climate historians have called the Little Ice Age. Extreme cold and wet weather caused crop failures, want, famine, and misery across much of Europe. The freakish weather raised the suspicion that evil forces were at work, and the widespread desperation made people more likely to act against those who disliked them and who would want to harm them if they had the power to do so. The historian Robin Briggs, who has written about this in fascinating detail, suggests that very deep-seated psychological mechanisms are the basis of witchcraft fears, deep-seated mechanisms that are with us to this very day. Briggs writes, "As a case in point, it is worth reflecting on how we react to that classic witchcraft situation, an unwelcome demand from a beggar. Common responses include real physical discomfort, barely repressed impulses to violence, and fantasies about possible retribution. This is a paradigm for many other situations in which we seem quite unable to detach ourselves from an invasive social world because our instincts hook into us despite ourselves. When this occurs at a time of unrest and famine, during an era when religious speculations have been much preoccupied with deviltry and evil, the results can be terrifying." Recent research suggests that most witchcraft prosecutions were initiated by ordinary people, and that witch hunters and inquisitors were only to a lesser extent the instigators. When Christensen made Haxan, however, historians tended to focus on the so-called demonological literature, learned treatises about witches and witchcraft, usually solemnly convinced of the reality of the witches' devil worship and urging that it be stamped out as harshly as possible. The witch hunts, in this view, were driven by the zealous determination of these cruel men. Christensen has used the most infamous of these works, as the main source for this section of the film. It is the witch hunter's manual Malleus Maleficarum, meaning the Hammer of Witches. It was first published in 1487, which is probably why Christensen sets the action in the year immediately following. It was written by two Dominican monks, was Heinrich Kramer, known in Latin as Henricus Institutoris, the other Jacob Sprenger. Sprenger was the dean of Cologne University, and the reputation of the two men as scholars contributed to the authority of the work. They were also experienced inquisitors who had themselves persecuted witches in various parts of Germany. They had encountered considerable resistance from local authorities, but in 1484 they were backed up by a bull from the Pope Innocent VIII. This papal bull, which fully accepted the existence of witchcraft, contributed mightily to the authority of the book. The book sets out in detail how a witchcraft trial should be conducted, making it a highly useful resource for witch hunters. The historian Sidney Anglo summarizes the book as follows. The Malleus was written to demonstrate precisely what witches were doing and how they could be stopped. It first establishes the truth of the existence of witchcraft and its heretical nature, then elucidates the principal evils practiced by witches and demons, and finally lays down formal rules for initiating legal action against witches, securing their conviction, and passing sentence upon them. The Malleus is notorious not only for its inquisitorial zealotry, the transparent eagerness of its authors to torture and burn, but also for its intense misogyny. Since women are feebler both in mind and body, it is not surprising that they should come more often under the spell of witchcraft. Women are intellectually like children, and indeed, just as through the first defects in their intelligence they are more prone to abjure the faith, so through their second defect of inordinate affections and passions they search for, brood over, and inflict various vengeances, either by witchcraft or by some other means. Wherefore it is no wonder that so great a number of witches exist in this sex. Here, Christensen suggests how sexual repression might fuel demonological fantasies. The obsession with carnality in the Malleus also shows through in its description of devils. And although devils have 1,000 ways of doing harm, yet their power remains confined to the privy parts. It is worth noting that the leading witch judge, the man sitting in the middle, is called Father Henrik. He has clearly been named after Heinrich Kramer. Christensen has taken many details directly from the Malleus. The man who is cursed so that he cannot close his mouth is one example. The idea that witches lose their sorcerer's powers if their feet are lifted off the ground is another. In section 5, we will see how witch hunters use systematic deceitfulness to trick a young woman into confessing that she is a witch. Their systematic dishonesty may seem like a caricature, but the procedure closely follows the Malleus. In an interview, Christensen called the Malleus the most scurrilous document in the history of the world. Now that the arrest has been made, the trial will begin its inexorable course. The terrible humiliations to which the unfortunate woman is subjected come straight out of the Malleus, which describes the elaborate precautions witch hunters must take to prevent their victims from attacking them with sorcery. Christensen's documentary concerns mean that his use of cinematic artistry is quite subtle and unobtrusive. The shots are very carefully lit. Christensen convinced his Swedish producers to let him shoot the film in Denmark at his old studio north of Copenhagen. The Swedes not only purchased the studio, but paid for a complete refurbishment, equipping it with state-of-the-art lighting equipment and cameras. This was one of the reasons why Haxan ended up being probably the most expensive film made in any of the Scandinavian countries during the whole silent period. The framing and cutting of this early version of the good cop, bad cop ploy is very effective. Another director might have chosen to show all three together in a single shot, perhaps cutting to closer views. Instead, Christensen emphasizes the violent to and fro pattern by going back and forth between two overlapping shots. Note the chair in the background, giving a jump cut effect because the old woman is now on one side of the frame, now on the other. Another reason for the escalating cost of the film was Christensen's somewhat erratic working habits. He often started late, and he preferred working at night, which meant huge overtime bonuses for cast and crew. He did believe, however, that it was necessary to shoot the film during the hours of darkness. He told an interviewer, "The film, which examines hysteria, deals with the dark side of human nature, and when the sun was shining during the day, it was not possible to bring out this side in the actors." The occult subject matter and Christensen's fascination with darkness has led some commentators to connect Haxan with German expressionist cinema. This is often linked to Christensen's well-known mastery of elaborate shadow effects. I've already mentioned how the mysterious X uses scenes shot against the light, creating elaborate silhouette effects. It can also be seen in this film, for instance in this shot, where the rack and other cruel devices of the torture chamber are shown only in silhouette, providing a grim frame for the clerical tribunal. However, it is misleading to think that this provides a really satisfactory parallel to the German expressionist films. It is true that some of these films, of which the best known is probably Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau's Nosferatu from 1922, do use shadow effects. Nosferatu very effectively uses the vampire shadow in place of the vampire himself. But the German films do not aim for the delicate chiaroscuro of Christensen's pictures. They seek strong graphic effects, usually created through framing and set design rather than lighting. Robert Wiene's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920 famously has the shadows painted directly onto the sets. Moreover, the German filmmakers sought to create a stylized world, so that the very irreality of it would allow vampires and madmen to exist freely within it. Christensen, however, goes in the opposite direction. He aims for realism. Rather than transforming reality into a jagged nightmare world, he tries to make the supernatural seem as real as everything else. Christensen also seeks a starker emotional realism. His extensive use of close-ups will probably not seem as striking to present-day viewers, but for a Scandinavian film made in 1921, it is highly unusual. This was partly a matter of taste, although in Sweden, the government film censors actively discouraged the use of close-ups, something I will return to in the next section. In the context of the early 20s, Christensen's work seemed innovative enough to be credited by at least one reviewer with having blazed the trail for the film that more than any other took the big facial close-up as its central artistic medium. When Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc opened in Copenhagen in April 1928, this reviewer wrote, referring specifically to the exploration of facial features in big close-ups. Just a few hundred meters into the film, one realizes that the Danish director with this film has gone down the same path which in this country was found long ago by Benjamin Christensen in the film Haxan, and which has since been followed by the Russians. Considering the powerful use it makes of faces, it is not surprising that when Christensen was asked in 1941 whether he could imagine Haxan as a talkie, he replied, "That would obviously be impossible. How does this devil speak, for instance?" The silent picture had its shortcomings, but it had advantages also. The talking picture is matter of fact. Everything is explained through words. The imagination doesn't have to do any work. The talking picture doesn't have the illusion and poetry of the silence. You cannot dream and add imaginatively to the tale and the characters shown in the film. Here we have lost some ground, and it is one of the most important tasks of the talking picture to reconquer that lost ground. One of Haxan's most impressive technical achievements is the shots of the witches riding their broomsticks through the air. Christensen explained that not only did he need to make the witches appear to be in motion, he also had to make the earth move in the opposite direction, and finally the clouds had to provide the keynote for the mood of the scene through unreal shapes, swells, and colors. According to Christensen, there were some 75 flying witches. They were each shot individually on separate pieces of film. In order to combine the images, the cinematographer, Johan Angerstjerne, built a pioneering optical printer specially for this purpose. Giving the audience the impression that the witches were flying forwards was made possible by having the cameraman move in the opposite direction on a cart past the witch, who was really sitting still on a broomstick. During the shooting, the witches were strapped onto a seat which could not be seen by the camera, held suspended between the floor and the ceiling of the studio, and had a broomstick placed between their legs. To get the heavy costumes to flap and flutter convincingly, Christensen brought in an airplane engine. For the backgrounds, Christensen initially had his cinematographer shoot pictures from a speeding train, but the results were unsatisfactory, also because it proved very difficult to find views that were not interrupted by telephone poles or other non-medieval looking features. Instead, an entire medieval town was constructed in miniature, each of the houses about 2 meters in height. This town, with trees, gardens, and everything, was mounted on a huge turntable which required 20 men to operate. The cameraman would then stand at the edge and film the moving landscape. Finally, in order to get the swirling, lowering clouds he wanted, he dispatched an assistant cameraman on a month-long trip to Norway to shoot skyscapes. The gnarled vegetation of the witchwood where the Sabbath takes place was created by uprooting and upending the trees in the large garden surrounding the studio where the film was shot. One of the actors recalls how sad the sight made her, but she had to admit that it looked very convincing. The demonic makeup effects are also very strikingly done. Speaking of special effects, the animated demon in the second section is also worth recalling. Stop-motion animation was known at the time, and the principles were described in a few early handbooks. But creating that wonderful animated demon must have required a great deal of technical experimentation. Another important aspect of Christensen's procedure was his casting. He used an interesting mix of well-known, experienced actors, young unknowns, and complete amateurs. The most prolific Danish director of the sound period, Alice O'Frederiks, worked as a script girl and also has a small role. You will see her as a maniacally laughing nun in part 6. The young wife of the sick man is played by Astrid Holm, who had just appeared in Victor Sjöström's The Phantom Carriage and would have a number of major film roles, most importantly that of the long-suffering wife in Carl Theodor Dreyer's wonderful Master of the House. The youngest of the monks, who is only very briefly seen here, is Ib Schönberg, who became one of the biggest stars of the Danish sound film, his chubby features appearing in more than 150 films in roles large or small. This is his first screen appearance. Of the amateurs, the most important is certainly Maren Petersen, who plays the old witch. She claimed that she had been the first Red Cross nurse in Denmark, but later she fell on hard times. She was selling flowers on the street when Christensen met her. He asked her to appear in the film, and she ended up playing this key role. Her performance was uniformly praised by reviewers, and she had another film role in Dreyer's Once Upon a Time. As I mentioned, the lusty friar who is given the love potion in section 2 was played by Oscar Stribold, a famous Danish comedy actor who was also hugely popular in Sweden. Tora Teje, a major Swedish star, has a key role in part 7 as a modern-day hysteric. In that section, one of the most celebrated Danish stage actors, Poul Reumert, has a small role as a jeweler. Before that, you will also see Clara Pontoppidan, one of the leading stars of the Danish silent film, as the nun Sister Cecilia, who gets a visitation from the devil. Finally, the second-in-command witch doctor is played by Åge Herzl, the top Danish screen villain of the period. He has later said that he also plays one of the demons, of course in heavy disguise. This may be a sly joke on Christensen's part. In this way, the demons unleashed upon the world are actually the witchcraft prosecutors. Haxan had its world premiere in Stockholm on September the 18th, 1922. The Danish premiere followed on November 7th. Most of the reviewers in both countries were lavish in their praise for the film, its high artistic ambitions, convincing performances, and outstanding cinematography. Yet, there were dissenting voices. The most hostile was BT, one of the popular Copenhagen papers, which devoted 2 pages to attacking the film beneath the headline, "Get this film off the screen." The reviewer acknowledged Christensen's craftsmanship, but attacked his decision to make a film about the great witch craze. "The fundamental error in this choice," wrote the reviewer, "is not that the subject is distant and specific, but that it from the first image to the last deals not only with the hysterical, as he terms it himself, but the frankly perverted." Speaking of the interrogation scene, the reviewer continued, "For more than half an hour, sadistic orgies are conducted on the screen. Meter after meter, you stare into the tormented, mummy-like hag face, which glowers right at you in fully shameless close-up until nausea rises dankly in your throat." Christensen's use of close-ups was quite provocative. The Swedish film censors were highly suspicious of close-ups as such, believing that there was something indecent and unnatural about showing naked faces enlarged to colossal proportions. Indeed, for Haxan, most of the cuts they demanded were of close-ups. In the second section, the finger being yanked off the dead man's hand and the face of the sleeping woman licking her lips had to be removed. In the interrogation scene, some of the close-ups of the old woman's face. During the Sabbath, the grease dripping from the cooked infant, the trampling on the cross, and the devil embracing the naked woman lying on her side. In this section here, the close-up of the face of the unfortunate young wife as she hangs cruelly suspended in the torture chamber was not permitted. In section 6, we will see instruments of torture applied to arms and legs, again in close-up, and these had to go too. In Denmark, on the other hand, the film was allowed to pass without cuts after having been endorsed by the famous biologist Wilhelm Johannsen, the man who introduced the concept of the gene. The leading psychiatrist Viggo Christiansen said that Haxan was epoch-making and of the very greatest interest, vouching for the accuracy of its scenes. The paper BT, which published the hostile review I just quoted, did not think that it really mattered that leading scientists expressed their admiration for the film. The popular audience, and especially young people, would not view it in the same way. For them, it would be an appeal to the basest instincts. The paper claimed that its views had been widely shared by members of the opening night audience. The question we were asked over and over again was this: how on earth could this film pass by the censor? BT continued. There is much nakedness in Benjamin Christensen's picture. The screen flashes with white backs, and nude silhouettes wander about in the mysterious glow of enchantment. But it is not this nudity which is most offensive about the picture. It is the satanic, perverted cruelty that blazes out of it. The cruelty we all know has stalked the ages like an evil, shaggy beast, the chimera of mankind. But when it is captured, let it be locked up in a cell, either in a prison or a madhouse. But do not let it be presented with music by Wagner and Chopin to a swanky audience in comfortable seats or to young men and women who have entered the enchanted world of the movie theater. It proved very difficult to get the film shown in the wider world. The explicit sexuality, the brutal torture scenes, the blasphemous acts we see carried out, and the extremely unflattering portrayal of the church, all these things were highly controversial. As a result, the film was banned in many places, and where it was released, it was usually only after considerable delay and extensive censorship. In Germany, the film was released in June 1924. Many scenes were cut, and German intertitles were very different from the originals, which are terse and effective. Not only were the German titles much more verbose, they were also more numerous. One reviewer complained, "The film, with its magnificent images, loses its most interesting episodes because of the far too ponderous, pedantic and dogmatic manner in which the German text accompanies the picture. One often has the embarrassing feeling of having been returned to the schoolroom." Moreover, the German version of the film apparently ended with a title which does not exist in the original version. It stated that the future would pass a similar judgment on the millions of victims of the World War that we now pass on the victims of the witchcraft delusion, stating in short that the First World War had been madness in much the same way as the Great Witch Hunt. This was a highly charged statement which could easily be viewed as a slur on the fatherland's glorious dead, and it certainly colored the reception of the film in Germany. In France, it was the overt anti-clericalism of the film that was the main bone of contention. Catholic organizations brought a complaint with the police against the film, alleging that it had defamed the church. Many reviewers also attacked it. In a sense, these charges were not wholly unjustified. Not only do the monks we see in the film act reprehensibly, the basic argument of the film, as well as the authorities Christensen drew on to make that argument, has a very strong inbuilt anti-clerical aspect. I will return to that later on. In the United States, the film was not shown publicly until March 1930, when it was presented at the Film Art Theater in Los Angeles, an early art cinema. The film reviewer of the Hollywood Daily Citizen was not really taken with the film. She wrote, "The picture may be informative, but it is not entertaining, nor was it meant to be. It is another example of the difference in the psychology of the American and European peoples. In the United States, where we have conquered nature by science and invention, we are optimistic and like our entertainments to be a portrayal of our dream life, a beautiful picture of our fondest imaginings. But in Russia, Denmark, and Scandinavia, where life is still stark, literature and art take the form of morbid reflection. We, who have never known great hardship, find it difficult to understand the unsavory themes for artistic outlet in some of these foreign countries." To some degree, this viewpoint has persisted long afterwards. Oddly, several of the most famous Scandinavian films from later years also feature witches and burnings at the stake, most prominently Dreyer's Day of Wrath and Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal. Indeed, in her review of the latter, the English film critic Dilys Powell made the caustic comment that whenever Scandinavian cinema has 5 minutes to fill, it burns a witch. Such burnings are in fact quite rare. But it is tempting to speculate about whether the re-release of Haxan in Denmark in early 1941 helped pave the way for Dreyer's Day of Wrath from 1943. In 1941, a commercial release of a silent picture was quite unheard of. Indeed, it was widely believed that the old celluloid strips had become so brittle that they would shatter like glass. Speaking of Haxan, a journalist who interviewed Christensen confidently claimed that for this reason, we will never know how we would think of it today. That was written in 1936. But 5 years later, the film was back on the screen. It was a success with both audiences and reviewers. Nearly 25,000 people saw it during the first week, which was a record for the cinema where it was shown. It had a successful run across Denmark, and later that year, a popular book was published on the history of witchcraft and superstition, using a great number of stills from the film as illustrations and concluding by saying that Haxan is one of the most moving accounts of the subject that has ever addressed mankind. Without reaching quite that level, the newspaper reviewers all praised the film, most of them expressing surprise that the film held up so well, despite the fact that it was so old. 20 years! One reviewer said, "Its story of superstition, violence, hysteria, and intolerance has the same currency today as it had then. Benjamin Christensen has not just probed a piece of cultural or uncultural history, but something universal." At this time, during the Second World War, Denmark was occupied by the Germans. And it is easy to read a passage like this as a veiled reference to that fact. Certainly, many commentators on Dreyer's Day of Wrath would subsequently see that film as an allegory of Nazi occupation. Dreyer's film does not, however, reflect the present in the unambiguous way that Arthur Miller's The Crucible used the Salem witch hunts of 1692 to comment on the McCarthyite persecutions of communists and fellow travelers in the 1950s. With Christensen's film, it is even harder to say whether he intended that audiences in 1941 should draw an analogy between the murderous medieval Inquisition and the Gestapo. There is no evidence to support such a conclusion. Christensen made his last film the next year, a spy melodrama set during the First World War called The Lady with the Light Gloves. It is quite dreadful, and shows him to be completely out of touch with the reality of the Second World War. One of Christensen's reasons for wanting Haxan re-released may have been that at the time he was trying to get the authorities to award him a license to run a cinema. Since this government licensing system held the number of cinemas down and limited competition, it was quite lucrative to have one. The licenses were generally used as a sort of honorary pension for distinguished people in the world of culture. They were only rarely given to people who had had anything to do with film or who knew anything about it. It is likely that Christensen believed a re-release of his best film would enhance his credibility and reputation as an artist of serious purpose and thus help him get such a license. Nevertheless, the re-release of Haxan may well have been important for Day of Wrath in a different way. During the 1930s, Danish film production had been completely dominated by light musical comedies and entertainment films, and there was no room for film artists like Christensen and Dreyer. But the success of Haxan helped to demonstrate that films with grim and serious subject matter made by an artistically daring experimentalist director could be commercially viable. This may well have helped persuade the production company Palladium to run the risk of letting Dreyer make his expensive and uncompromising masterpiece. There were also some more surprising reactions to Haxan in 1941. When it played the town of Horsens in September of that year, the following newspaper item appeared. Last night, the police had to take custody of a 23-year-old man who was walking about in the street with his hands stretched out in front of him and who was very short of breath. He was first thought to be intoxicated, but it was soon made clear that he had not touched alcohol at all. He was taken by ambulance to the municipal hospital, where it was necessary to administer artificial respiration to him. The young man, who has been discharged from hospital today, has declared that the reason for his state was that he had been to see Haxan last night and had been so mesmerized by its unsettling scenes that he had gone into convulsions. The film became a favorite of the Parisian surrealists, partly because of its anti-clericalism, but certainly also because of its weirdness. The association of the film with extreme states of mind was given further currency when the film was released in America in 1967 in a reworked version with a rambling, loopy soundtrack commentary by the writer and dope prophet William S. Burroughs. In a way, this is a somewhat ironic fate for a film firmly committed to rationalist ideas, especially the struggle against obscurantism. This is made very clear by the devastating conclusion of the model witch trial we have followed over the last 3 reels. Note how effective it is when Christensen cuts a series of brief, succinct intertitles into a continuous shot, building to a shattering climax. In the Malleus, there is an exemplary situation described where witch hunters have tricked a witch in exactly the way depicted here. It may seem here that the witch hunters are behaving in a manner that is completely villainous. But they were men who were completely convinced of the justice of their cause and the absolute necessity of protecting the Christian community from the threat of the powers of darkness. In that struggle, it was legitimate to use any sort of deceit or subterfuge to get the witches to confess. It was probably Troels Lund's history that drew Christensen's attention to the ghastly idea that God found the smell of burning witches well-pleasing. The claim that millions were burnt is, as we have seen, completely wrong, but it is presented here with great rhetorical aplomb. In one of the interviews he gave in connection with the 1941 re-release, Christensen was asked what he had initially gotten out of his pioneering cinematic achievement. He replied that the film companies both here and abroad avoided me for 2 years. I was an experimentalist and therefore dangerous. As I have said previously, Haxan was very costly, and the controversy that surrounded it severely limited its commercial viability on the international market. Furthermore, its Swedish production company had run into severe financial difficulties when Hollywood took over large chunks of their market in the early 1920s. For these reasons, Christensen was never able to make the 2 sequels to Haxan he had envisaged, called The Saint and The Spirits. I will have more to say about these projects later in this section. Now that the trial has been concluded, Christensen returns to the non-narrative format of the second section. We again see the wise women and others who actually did perform various sorts of magic. Christensen will soon add further types of witches to this. First, those whose confessions were extracted by torture, and second, those who suffered from hysterical illnesses and actually themselves believed that they were witches, driven by inexplicable compulsions to commit blasphemous acts. This simple spell, causing impotence by tying knots on a string, seems to have featured in folk magic long before and long after the witch craze, but the demonologists considered it to be a monstrous crime. You may notice that we see some characters here whom we saw arrested or denounced during the trial segment of the picture, and whom we would assume had gone to the stake. But here they reappear. We need not assume that they are the same people, however. It is worth stressing that while the trial features a number of named characters and has a clear narrative progression, it is not intended as a story of some particular people, not a drama in the traditional sense, but an exemplary, typical description just as much as the little situations we've just seen. Christensen made this very clear, saying, "I have sought not to present a schematic rendering of the witch trials in a dramatic form, which would have meant taking one witch trial as an example and then constructed a plot around it. So, not according to the usual way of making films. My film has no continuous story, no plot. It could perhaps best be classified as a cultural history lecture in moving pictures. The goal has not only been to describe the witch trials simply as external events, but through cultural history to throw light on the psychological causes of these witch trials by demonstrating their connections with certain abnormalities of the human psyche, abnormalities which existed throughout history and still exist in our midst." We'll come back to these abnormalities in a little while, but first we must admire the skill of Christensen's designer Richard Low, who manufactured these unpleasantly realistic instruments of torture. The cool, almost textbook illustration-like way they are displayed only adds to the horror. Christensen spoke eloquently of the power of the image. "A silent scene can express more than 1,000 words. But if these 1,000 words already exist, and if one must express them in images, one will be made painfully aware that the words are infinitely superior to the pictures. And the joy over the image vanishes because one feels one is about to commit sacrilege. On the other hand, one may often get to see images made only and solely as images, so full of life, so mighty, so moving, that one feels them to be superior to words, even infinitely superior. And this is what must be made clear to everyone, that the word and the picture are two separate art forms, which have different ways of speaking to us. And therefore we must have two different kinds of authors of words and authors of pictures. Let us soon have authors of the moving picture, artists of the film who work directly for the film and stage their films themselves. The presence of a powerful film artist masterminding the production behind the scenes makes itself painfully felt here. The idea that directors should write their own screenplays based on a visual imagining of what the film should be like, so that the original vision would be transferred to the screen, was an idea that Christensen returned to again and again in writings and interviews from the time Haxan was made. Christensen said, "We must get closer to the heart of the concept of cinema. We must set ourselves the goal of really understanding the cinema, knowing what it is, so that we may find thoughts, ideas, social issues that in an altogether different fashion may find their expression in images rather than words. For we may be sure of this much already, that the moving picture, through a way completely different from that of the word, has the power to make the human heart tremble, to bear a message from soul to soul, a way more closely related to music than to words. Let us have film authors, or rather film artists, who both write and direct their movies themselves." In a different interview, Christensen said, "We must get to the point where the film director and the film writer are no longer separate concepts, but are merged into a single whole which we must find a name for. In my language, I shall call him an image maker." Christensen obviously sought to fulfill this ideal himself. At the beginning of the film, I remarked on the very direct way Christensen presents himself as the true maker of the film, that the film is a product of his vision. That's how Christensen thought it should be. He said, "Like every other artist, film artists must display in the future their own personality in their works. When we leave the theater, we should know the person who has spoken to us from the screen." Unfortunately, Christensen was not able to fulfill this ideal in any of his subsequent projects. I mentioned before the films The Saint and The Spirits, which were intended to form a trilogy of superstition along with Haxan. The Saint seems to have been intended as a study of religious hysteria. In the bibliography for Haxan, Christensen lists several works that deals with famous saints being afflicted by violent visions, and it seems clear that his intention was to describe these in the subsequent film. For this film, a few scenes were actually shot, but the project was never completed. Christensen not only appears at the devil. In this very brief shot, he's also Jesus Christ. In an article he wrote around the time when Haxan was released, he described how the other project, The Spirits, was supposed to turn out. He wrote, "Another idea I had at the same time, and which would also have been realized had not the monetary crisis come, was to set up a laboratory. To gather there the best mediums in the world, especially the so-called materialization mediums, because I believe that it is possible that it is the technique of the cinema that will be the road through which the world will learn something positive about these phenomena. It is hardly possible completely to deny their reality, despite the fact that the frequent exposures of fraud more and more makes one doubt them altogether. Christensen made his next films in Germany, an elegant sex comedy called Seine Frau die Unbekannte, his wife the unknown, and a film which no longer exists, based on the 1890s free love novel The Woman Who Did. He then accepted an offer from Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer to come to Hollywood, where he made a melodrama called The Devil's Circus and a Lon Chaney picture about the Russian Revolution called Mockery. In both, his concern with injustice and his insistence that all people have some good in them recurs. The Devil's Circus is about an ex-con who falls in love with a circus performer and is reformed by love. Mockery concerns a brutish peasant who sacrifices his life for the sake of a noble woman he has earlier tried to rape after she saves him from summary execution. For another studio, First National, Christensen made a Chinatown underworld film and 3 comedy mysteries, only one of which survives. That's 7 Footprints to Satan from 1929, a fast-paced haunted house comedy filled with all sorts of outre surprises and a slightly kinky atmosphere. Variety noted, "This is unquestionably one of the hottest exhibitions of iniquity done in a long while." Christensen's Hollywood career foundered with the coming of sound, and he eventually returned to Denmark, where he made a directorial comeback in 1939 with Skilsmissens Børn, The Children of Divorce, a social problem picture. He followed this with another social problem picture, Barnet, The Child, about illegal abortion. Gå med mig hjem, Come Home With Me, from 1941, was more unusual, telling the story of a middle-aged female lawyer whose home is a refuge for various unfortunate people whom she believes should get a second chance. The spy drama Damen med de lyse handsker, The Lady with the Light Gloves, was, as I said, a fiasco. But Christensen got his cinema license and lived the last 15 years of his life as the manager of a neighborhood picture house in a Copenhagen suburb. The last part of the film has a contemporary background. It attempts to link witchcraft directly with hysteria. Christensen begins with a series of shots of old women, shots that are staged very much like medical photographs. Christensen, as we know, was very fascinated by the potential of the scientific film, and the psychiatrists who had made the link between witchcraft and hysteric illness were pioneers of medical photography. The famous Jean-Martin Charcot said, "In truth, I am altogether nothing but a photographer. I write down what I see." Charcot was the founder of modern neurology and the head of the Salpêtrière Asylum in Paris, which in the late 19th century was the largest hospital or asylum in Europe, probably in the world. It covered nearly a quarter of the entire 13th arrondissement in southeastern Paris and held some 5,000 patients. Charcot applied his knowledge of brain anatomy to the study of neurological illnesses and became internationally famous. He attracted a large number of students, the most famous of whom was Sigmund Freud from Vienna. In the 1870s and 1880s, he turned his attention to hysteria, which he argued was a real disease, not some sort of imagined illness. In his view, hysteria was caused by the combination of hereditary and environmental factors, and it was characterized by sensory motor abnormalities, a distinct four-part epileptiform attack, and a battery of accessory symptoms. This means that Charcot's patients suffered often very violent convulsive seizures. Charcot had a permanent photographic establishment within the Salpêtrière. There, the photographer took pictures of his patients as they went through the various dramatic stages of their convulsive attacks. The neurotics that Christensen will show us in the following sequence are not afflicted in the same way. However, in the works of both Charcot himself and his many students, neurotic behaviors like the ones we see here are clearly linked to hysteria. One may of course ask oneself how somnambulism and similar behaviors are linked to witchcraft. This emerges through the practice of retrospective diagnosis, as it was called. This practice consisted in looking at works of art and historical records and trying to identify sufferers from hysterical illnesses in the past. The assumption was that the illnesses and their symptoms were the same throughout history. Much of what Charcot and his students found through these retrospective diagnoses were hysterical behaviors that occurred in religious contexts, states of religious ecstasy or demonic possession. The idea that religious ecstasy is a symptom of hysterical illness is obviously not one that is very congenial to believers. This may have been quite intentional. In many countries, there were struggles in the late 19th century between free thinkers and traditionalists of various sorts, among whom churchmen were prominent. In this struggle, the witch hunts were a powerful weapon against the church. They provided clear evidence that the church in centuries past had been a force for obscurantism, that it had pursued innocent people and sent them to their deaths. In Germany, many historians engaged themselves in this struggle and investigated the witch hunts with this very purpose. In Denmark, some of the writers that Christensen drew on for inspiration also followed the same political beliefs. It was, however, in France that the struggle between church and state was most intense, and Charcot and his followers were very much involved. It was particularly Charcot's pupil Bourneville, the superintendent of the hospitals of Paris, who was in the forefront of this struggle. Bourneville tried to use his position as superintendent to get the church out of the business of taking care of the sick, something that it had been involved in for centuries. Many of the hospitals of Paris were still directly run by the church. Bourneville was very interested in the phenomenon of witchcraft. He edited a series of books called the Bibliothèque Diabolique, the Diabolical Library. Here, he republished contemporary accounts of witchcraft trials and demonological works. One of the books in the Bibliothèque Diabolique was particularly significant. It was a book written by a 16th century Dutch doctor named Johann Weyer. It was called De Praestigiis Daemonum, on the trickery of demons, and it was first published in 1563. This book was written as a rejoinder to the Malleus Maleficarum. Weyer claimed that witches were actually sufferers of illnesses of the mind. Weyer's work could be used by Bourneville to show that a more enlightened viewpoint actually existed at the time, making the churchmen seem all the more obscurantist. Weyer could also be claimed as a heroic ancestor for these modern men of science. Indeed, Weyer has been called the true father of modern psychiatry. In that way, witchcraft-related phenomena were given a crucial position in the development of their science by the psychiatrists of the Charcot school. Indeed, some of the hysterical symptoms Charcot considered most important were anesthesias, insensitive spots in various parts of the body, similar to those the witch prickers had searched for centuries before. Charcot even adopted the demonological term stigmatae to describe them, so that the very language of psychiatry came to possess demonological terms. The psychiatrists themselves, most notably Freud, have compared their activities to that of inquisitors. Now, Christensen was familiar with all these works, and the link was also evident to the scientists. Viggo Christensen, the Danish psychiatrist, described Haxan scenes as valid illustrations for the Bibliothèque Diabolique. He said, "I can testify that scientifically speaking, it is altogether correct and reliable in every detail and without any mistakes at all. I find it astonishing that a layman like Benjamin Christensen should have been able to such an extent to penetrate and master the interesting theories advanced first of all by the famous French scholar Jean-Martin Charcot about hysteria as the cause of witchcraft and the witch trials, and that Christensen should have been able to reproduce them in images in such a convincing and clear manner." Still, Viggo Christensen liked the modern section less than the rest, an opinion which was widely shared. When Haxan was first released, many reviewers said that this was the weakest part of the film, and Christensen himself in later years tended to agree. When the film was re-released in 1941, he told an interviewer that he had considered removing this section altogether, but he had decided that the film should stand as it was when he first made it. A different opinion of this last section came from the Swedish Dr. Fogelqvist. Fogelqvist was known in Sweden for having spoken out on various occasions against the cinema, but here he approved. He wrote, "The most important and valuable thing about Haxan is that it does not end with either the historical or the sensational, but brings us up to our own day. The horror is discharged in a feeling of relief at the comparison between the different ways past and present ages have treated these degenerations of the human psyche. For once, one reveres one's own day and feels, having passed through this historical hell, that it is easier to live and breathe now. It is not without value to bring about such emotions in modern people, who mostly tend to see the dark sides of the present. It seems likely that the reason Christensen chooses to devote such a relatively long scene to the kleptomaniac should be found in Christensen's persistent concern with giving criminals a second chance, that wrongdoers are not evil, merely unwell. One cannot deny that the modern section lacks the magnificent vividness of the earlier parts of the film. A Swedish reviewer put it this way in 1922. The arrangement is not convincing. For one thing, this section is quantitatively too short to work as a counterbalance to the previous long, compact and detailed one. For another, it does not seem to deal with quite the same subject matter. The belief in witchcraft was, after all, a phenomenon with a strong religious coloring. Certainly, the kleptomania episode here, with its one neurotic, does not really function as a convincing parallel to anything. Perhaps it is because this woman, unlike most of the others, is not driven by raging but repressed emotions and desires. She simply seems cast adrift. On the other hand, kleptomania is a characteristic example of the compulsive behaviors the psychiatrists of Charcot's school explicitly linked to witchcraft. To a great extent, the weakness of this section is due to the fact that Christensen seems to have intuitively understood the consuming power of the dark forces behind witchcraft beliefs rather better than the implacably cool-headed scientists he took as his authorities. Another Swedish reviewer put it well. Hysteria does not explain everything, and in particular does not explain itself. How are people, half a millennium into the future, going to try to explain the madness of our times, which spread from country to country, made the cannons thunder, and in a few years cost the lives of millions of people? Is one not forced, despite all attempts at explanation, in the back of one's own mind to acknowledge that the madness of both the Middle Ages and today grows out of hysteria and hypocrisy, but also out of the inextinguishable stupidity and wickedness of mankind? The film ends as a paean to Enlightenment, science and humanitarianism, but it does not pretend that the dark forces have been completely abolished, and Haxan is nothing if not a demonstration of their power. It is the unique masterpiece of a great filmmaker. Christensen himself said, It is a great fortune for an artist just once in a lifetime to be allowed to do what he wants. That happened with Haxan.